A young man named Evan is taking care of his mother. The condition seems extremely dramatic, and in the room filled with sickly yellow light, he tries his best to remain positive. His mother does the same. After asking her son questions about his life, she goes so far as to start telling a joke. And even though it is funny, Evan only chuckles once and soon realizes that it is the last joke he will ever hear from his mother. Gazing at her son, the woman draws her last breath, and her fingers are frozen in her son's hands. Evan is late to express his gratitude and love for her. After the funeral, he sits at a bar with his friend, Tommy. Evan works in this bar, and after discussing the short and intimate funeral that went down, he heads towards the bathroom, where a couple is fighting over a cigarette. They seem to be in quite an aggressive mood. The man crashes into Evan as the latter makes his way along the bar and, not knowing where to take his anger and frustration, decides to let it all out on him. It is a bad decision on his part, however. Even though Tommy does his best to lighten the situation and despite Evan's attempts to make him go away in pieces, the man grabs an empty bottle, prepares for a fight, and receives a punch from Evan. The latter has had an extremely bad day, and he doesn't seem to be able to control his anger either. When Tommy and Evan try to cool down outside after the fight that went down, Mike, the manager, comes out. He seems to be a good friend to both, but the owner of the bar seems to have come after the incident and fired Evan. Mike tells him to change his environment, shift gears, and go someplace he has never been, before he talks to the boss and tries his best to make him reconsider. He knows that Evan needs this job more than anything right now, and he swears he will bring him back. He just needs time. In the next scene, the friends are discussing Evan's job opportunities here, where a car arrives in his driveway. The man he just fought sticks his head out and throws a bunch of violent threat words at them. The boys jump up and scream back at him until the car drives away. Now Evan is sure that he is going to first be sued and then beat up by baseball bats. Like a true friend, Tommy discusses the possibility of staying over for the night at his house to help him out if anything happens. But as it seems, the only bed available is Evan's mother's final bed and Tommy isn't drunk enough to sleep in there. Before heading off on his wriggly feet, he suggests that he call up some girl to soothe his pains. But Evan rejects that petty solution to his pains immediately. That night, however, he still fell in love with Tommy's suggestion. Even the girl he's with, however, sobers up suddenly and gives him advice to go to another country and recenter himself. She clearly doesn't want to be intimate with him, but when she sees him dozing off into sleep in a matter of seconds from exhaustion, she joins him and puts her head on his shoulder. The next morning, Evan is woken up by the sound of knocking and finds himself alone in bed. From the window, he sees an officer walking away. This is the moment when he decides to follow Mike's advice and fly far away. Having no idea where to go, he asks the airline representative to choose the country for him. And even though the suggestion is based on the most cliché opinion, he books the soonest flight to Italy and spends the entire time in the air, drinking and watching Harry Potter. After walking around in Rome aimlessly and with a heavy heart, he finds himself more alienated than liberated. That night, he finds a bar and thinks to himself that it'll be the best place to spend the night. Inside, he meets Tom and Sam, two friends on a holiday who are eager to have as much fun in Italy as is humanly possible. They welcome him into their group with open arms, get him a drink, and even invite him on a road trip the next day. Their over-the-top male energy is, in moments, a little too much for Evan, but overall, he finds their company relieving. During the first portion of the road trip, the trio expresses as much energy as possible until they all need a recharge. Here, Tom suddenly starts telling the story of his heartbreak. Honest and vulnerable, his manner of speaking is surprisingly intimate. The road trip ends then, and the three pals start making their way into a coastal town. Walking slowly on a plaza, Evan notices a girl in a red dress sitting in the middle of it. They exchange eye contact, and the vision of this girl leaves a clear mark in his mind. Later that evening, he sees her standing at a bar. Leaving his friends to go get another round, he decides to go up to her, saying that if he stared at her any longer without initiating a conversation, he would look like a proper creep. Surprisingly, however, the girl doesn't seem eager to talk. Right away, she tells him to go to his place. Evan likes this girl a lot. In his mind, she represents an attractiveness he hasn't come across in a long time, and the straightforward, hollowly sexual attitude this girl holds troubles him a little. He wants to get to know her first and go out on a date, and in this reluctance, he makes it much more complicated than it needs to be. The girl has no intention to follow him on lousy dates, so she just rejects him and walks away. Naturally, Evan's new friends are extremely amused by all of this. The next morning, the latter decide that it is too expensive in here and head away to Amsterdam. They ask Evan if he wants to tag along too, but the latter prefers to stay. That day, wandering around aimlessly, he finds a job poster and makes his way towards a local farm. There he meets the owner, who is offering a room and food in exchange for a working hand. His name is Angelo, and he seems like an interesting man. After showing him around and explaining what his job will entail with his broken English, he starts preparing a meal. Looking around his kitchen, one thing that catches Evan's attention the most is a picture of a woman who turns out to be Angelo's late wife. Their introductory coverage takes a gloomy turn for a moment, but Angelo seems to be over the most painful part of the grieving process at this point. After getting a job, Evan takes a stroll around the tourist town and suddenly notices the girl he talked to yesterday. Catching up to her, he tries to lure her into going on a date with him 3 times, but to no avail. The girl doesn't seem interested, and she has a job to do. Saying she doesn't know if she wants to go out with him or not, she enters a museum, and Evan follows her inside. There, as the two make their way through pieces of ancient Roman culture, they learn a lot more about each other. Evan tells her about himself, saying that he used to be a cook and that he now works and lives here on a local farm. The girl's name seems to be Louise. As she says, she is studying evolutionary genetics here. As a paid student, she lives here on the university's expenses and does her research on the homogeneous population of this little town. Having conversed with Evan in this fashion, she sees that he isn't an uninteresting man and decides to spend the rest of the day with him. Later that evening, they sit on a spacious plaza, drinking coffee. The layers of themselves that they reveal are a little deeper in this moment. Louise seems to have traveled around the world until her manner of speaking became a mishmash of various accents. Her family would vacation here every summer, so this town holds a lot of meaning to her. Evan invites her to get a bottle of wine then, but Louise decides to check the degree of his romantic attitudes first. She asks him to write a letter to her while she finishes up her espresso. Evan writes it in silence and shoots a sweet and anxious smile at her afterwards. Louise's expressions become brighter after reading his words. The letter seems to have worked really well. Louise seems to like him more and more. After having a nice, cozy sit-around, holding wine glasses, Evan expresses an attractive kind of self-awareness. And after getting tipsy from alcohol and from the sound of waves at night, Louise finds herself exploding in anger after they leave their table. Her accent becomes progressively more British as she admits to Evan that she's a big mister to herself. Undiscovered science, confusing biochemistry, and crazy hormones are all intertwined in her magical self. She walks up to a picture of a recently drawn kid, and the conversation takes on a gloomy and philosophical turn until Evan gets it back on track. Everything about him seems to release a kind of emotion Louise has never felt before. Gradually, she finds herself drawn to him stronger and stronger, and the wine bottle rolls over to the stony pavement from her fingers after Evan's lips touch hers. That night, the story takes on an incredibly mysterious and horrifying turn. After soothing their passions and going to sleep in Louise's apartment, we see her beating face, deformed and gray, as her clawy fingers and pointy teeth have taken on a demonic black. Suddenly, she is woken up from her dream abruptly. Next time we see her, she is making her way across an archway, wriggling left and right unnaturally on her disfigured legs. The next morning, Evan wakes up alone in her bed and goes to work. He seems to enjoy his life here a lot. After he leaves, Louise gets back to her apartment, and we get to see her morning routine. She seems to have different colored eyes, and if she doesn't take some medicine, her skin seems to become extremely sensitive to the sun. After work, Evan passes through the same archway in which we saw Louise earlier, and sees a decapitated cat being taken away. The sight takes him aback, but he continues walking. While passing by a cafe, he runs into Louise again. This town is truly small. Here, Louise pulls a prank on him, acting as if she doesn't recognize him at all after last night. For a moment, Evan is smitten, thinking that it is all true. They have a good laugh about it afterwards and walk together in the narrow, soggy streets. Gradually, they learn more about each other's characters in this manner. These are the simple things, like the fact that Louise likes eating too much good food and Evan likes smoking too much tobacco. Later that night, we see him in her apartment again, checking out her pet rabbits. They seem to be lab animals, rescued by Louise after research was done on them. Here, Evan learns that she can speak more languages than she can count. The night continues a delightful tone as she joins him on a couch and takes one hit from his rolled tobacco, but suddenly, she sees a gray stain bubbling up on her thigh and excuses herself to go to the bathroom. She needs to get her medicine immediately. As Evan walks around the house, going through Latin books and strange anatomy encyclopedias, Louise fights a demonic metamorphosis in the bathroom. For a moment, we fear for Evan as blood fills Louise's shower, but thankfully, it all ends well. She comes out cheerful, as if nothing has happened. Evan invites her to go to the beach this Sunday, but she declines this offer, saying that she's taking some medication that makes her skin sun-sensitive. This entails that Evan will have to mostly meet her at night. Finally, they have supper, and the rabbits listen as Louise tells him about how she is trying to become vegetarian. They slept on her couch that night, and the next morning, while standing in the bathroom before heading to work, Evan noticed something strange lying around on the floor. It is a syringe she used last night. That day, he shares some of his thoughts with Angelo. Telling him about Louise, he admits that he likes her a lot but can't seem to look away from the fact that she acts a little weird sometimes. He also says that he found something peculiar in her bathroom. The advice he is given isn't particularly practical. Angelo urges him to pick his poison, adding that the Italian poison is hands down the best in the world. After work, he goes out to see some scenery on the top of a cliff and is encountered by a sight so ominous and sinister that, despite his skeptical character, he finds himself frozen in front of it, The body of a deceased lamb is lying half-rotten in a shade as a yellow snake goes through its open jaws. That night, while having dinner together and cracking jokes about each other's jobs, Evan suddenly failed to fight the urge to ask her about the syringe. He feels bad about it, but it troubles him a lot. Louise is amused by this question. She says that she has a complex medical condition that comes to her every now and then. In any case, it is nothing to be worried about. Then she asks him about his parents, and the conversation takes on a dramatic turn. Naturally, Evan doesn't want to talk about his parents. The whole reason for his coming to Italy originally was to get away from having to think about it. Louise gets mad. If he asks her to share something very intimate, then, in turn, he should be open to talking about his personal life more freely too. This double standard that Evan seems to hold troubles Louise a lot. This is partly why she remains stern-faced when he asks a waitress to take a photo of them. Speaking of the photo, Evan is surprised by the result. Louise's face looks as if she moved right when the waitress pressed the shutter. This isn't what she wants to discuss, however. She asks him again about his parents, and when the latter avoids talking about it again, she gets her things and walks away in anger. Evan goes after her until they both end up on a rocky beach. Enlightened by moonlight, Evan apologizes, saying that it won't hurt to pour his heart out to a person like Louise. In a linear and straightforward fashion, he tells her the whole truth about his family. His father suddenly passed away from a heart attack before his mother got cancer. He had to quit college to take care of her, and it's been a week since she passed away too. The best way to describe where he's at right now is that he feels like a grown man, missing his parents and having no idea where to go next in life. In light of this honesty, he thinks that it's Louise's turn to share something intimate. This is when she decides to take off her contact lenses and reveal to him that she has different colored eyes. Clumsy compliments about her eyes wrap up their conversation in the nicest way. In the next scene, Evan finds out that there is an active volcano standing proudly just across the horizon. This is why the soil is so productive in this town. Meanwhile, Louise is having some trouble at work. She is told by her research participant that there is a really bad smell in her room. Soon, she finds out that she's getting black marks all over her body and discovers, to her horror, that she's out of medicine. Struggling her way through town towards a country road, she gets to some abandoned building and, shaking hands, starts preparing for a ritual. It is a blood ritual containing some Latin scripture, the sacrifice of a white rabbit, and complete skin shedding. That night, there were no more pet bunnies at her home. Evan finds her lying on the couch, feeling extremely sick, and like a true boyfriend, he takes proper care of her. The next morning, Evan finishes up his work early and spends the majority of the day by himself. Before the sun sets down, he sees a bunch of Americans having fun on the beach and feels disgusted by their loud manners. The fact that a significant process of change is flowing inside Evan is evident in what he does next. He goes to a museum and buys a book about Roman art for Louise. A woman with different colored eyes is depicted on the cover of it, and as he moves around the museum, we find that there are other paintings of women whose eyes look strangely like Louise's. In the next scene, he gifts the book to the latter and learns that a tourist season is coming up. Soon, the town will start overflowing with people, and before that happens, Louise wants to show him something. That day, Evan finds, to his surprise, that Louise has a boat. Thanks to her, he also discovers a place the tourists will never find. It is a cave in which they found many Roman sculptures. In this mesmerizing place, Evan feels an irresistible urge to kiss her. Later that night, they are sitting on a plaza together, conversing cheerfully about how Evan barely changes clothes, when suddenly, Louise understands that she's starting to get sick again. Hurrying to get away, she manages to make it seem as if she really has to go. She struggles to maintain balance in the streets afterwards. Having a terrible time, we think she won't even make it to her apartment when suddenly she stops to catch her breath and recollect her strengths when one of the Americans we saw earlier appears in the streets and sees her, resting upon a stone wall. He approaches her, thinking he can bring her up to his hotel room to have fun, and when he gets no answer, he decides to use brute force until he finds out to his terror that what stands in front of him isn't particularly human anymore. Something, most cozily resembling a reptile, ends his life in a matter of seconds. The only person spectating this is a blind woman, peeking from her doorway. In the following scene, Evan spends some time with Angelo on an evening meadow. They have a nice, slow-burning conversation about mourning in which Evan finds out that Angelo is still deeply in love with his late wife. This is a testimony to him that love transcends time and space. Inspired by this, he visits Louise that night with a bright face, holding flowers. His partner, however, seems to be feeling extremely low. At first, she intends not to let him inside, but then she sees a couple of policemen strolling nearby, so she has no choice but to let him in. There, talking slowly and feeling guilty, she tells him that they shouldn't see each other anymore. Even though it's been only a week, she knows that it will be a major heartbreak for Evan, and she is sorry for that. Explaining her decision, she comes up with blurry, generalized statements that tell Evan nothing particular. He feels lied to and confused. Anger bubbles up inside his heart as he remembers how they were supposed to be intimate with one another. To him, it isn't fair that she doesn't go into details of her problems. But in the end, instead of exploding in anger, he walks up to her and tells her what he really feels under this anger. He senses that she can be the love of his life. And if she truly feels something towards him too, then whatever the problem might be, she should try and fight it to give their love the chance that it deserves. The door is open to him then, and without saying anything else, he leaves her apartment. He doesn't pay any attention to it, but while tramping away, he passes by a policeman, talking to the blind old woman who was there when the incident happened last night. The next day, when Angelo finds out that Louise broke up with Evan, he is extremely disappointed in him. A policeman comes into his farm then, and he tells Evan to run away. His work here is illegal. Evan trusts him with his life, so he dashes away as quickly as possible and drinks his pain away in a bar. This is a quick recap of his story that the barman heard that evening. Evan lost his parents back in the US, until he lost his job and got the police chasing after him. Last night, he lost his girlfriend here before losing his job and getting chased by immigration police. It is hard not to empathize with him. In the following scene, we see him standing at Louise's door that night. For a while, his knocks are unanswered, but then he hears a peculiar noise coming from inside. Thinking that she is in trouble, he opens the door as far as the chain lets him go and sees a bunch of signs that Louise is in danger. Reactively, he uses all his strength to open the door, and he sees something he will never forget in his life. Louise is in half-squid form as tentacles keep growing out of her. Wriggling on the floor, her head begins to change form too. When frozen in one place from fear and horror, Evan sees her medicine lying around next to her. He dashes forward quickly, and after a few unsuccessful attempts, he manages to help her out. It takes a few seconds for Louise to get back to her human form. Evan's eyes express an uncontrollable thrill and fear until he hears her voice, asking him to start a shower. In the next scene, both are sitting across the table in silence. Evan is unnaturally uptight in his chair when he asks her what she is. After what he saw, he needs an explanation, and when Louise acts reluctant to start talking about her condition, Evan stands up abruptly and storms out into the streets. Louise feels bad. She finds it hard to explain it to someone else for the first time, but nevertheless, she catches up to him quickly and starts by revealing that the Roman lady depicted in the book that was gifted to her is herself. She posed for that painting almost 2,000 years ago. Her eyes are like this because she has hereditary heterochromia. Within the last few decades, she has found out stuff about herself that might seem deeply troubling to Evan. This night, however, can hardly become more troubling for Evan, so he listens to Louise as she goes on about how her body uses embryonic stem cells to maintain its youth. This way, she can stay the same age and heal very fast. Evan doesn't understand most of it, but he manages to gather up the fact that she got pregnant after being with him. His eyes are about to fall off when he hears Louise continue to say that when her body conceives, she becomes a healthy 20-year-old with 50% new DNA. She stays the same throughout the following 20 years, until her body needs new cells again. This way, she's a different person every 20 years. This is why she dumps him. Evan wouldn't have even recognized her. To explain her monstrous transformations, she says that her body always goes crazy before using the cells. It rots and turns into creatures from our evolutionary past. Here Evan is also told about the fate of the rabbits, and it all leads to such frustration in him that he runs into a plaza in search of a phone and asks her to give him a minute to cool down. In a state of panic, he calls Tommy and, struggling to find the correct formulation of what he just learned, conveys to him in the most anxious and desperate manner that his new girlfriend/monster got pregnant with him, and she is starting to give birth to herself. From the other side, he hears Tommy telling him that he just smoked a huge bowl and can hardly make out what he is saying. There is no use in trying to resume this conversation. So disappointed that Tommy had to smoke exactly in this moment, he hangs up the public phone and turns around. What he sees next puts him out of the state of panic immediately. Angelo is standing at the church gate, crying over his deceased wife. The absolute truth that, compared to love, everything else seems extremely insignificant shines through Evan's brain. He gets back to Louise then and tells her that he is ready to be with her despite everything. Naturally, Louise is reluctant to let him do that. She reveals it to him now that she can use her adult cells to cut this unending cycle of eternal living. But to do it for a man she's been with for a few weeks seems crazy to her. To add to everything, she will begin to change form very soon, so Evan is eager to at least spend this time with her. He suggests going on a road trip, and at first, Louise prefers not to go. But then they both see an immigration officer in front of them and decide to get away from this city and go to Naples. It all seems like a never-ending, peculiar dream to Evan, driving across Italy to Naples with her. In one moment, she asks him to pull over and gets on top of him. A number of details about the intricacies of her struggling life are expressed here as she kisses him until they hear police sirens outside. Louise gives them a sign that everything is okay, and they leave them alone. When the morning comes, both are on rocky terrain near the ocean. The reason why Evan chose to be with her despite seeing her monstrous form still puzzles Louise. She finds herself struggling to name the feelings she has towards him too. At first glance, there is nothing amazingly profound to be seen in Evan, but being in his company feels awfully relieving to her. He really seems to be in love, and the underlying meaning behind this love can hardly be expressed. They spent the next day in Naples in the most casual manner. Sitting in a church, Evan naively asks her if she knows anything about God and the mysteries that govern the universe. But just because science cannot yet explain why her body acts this way doesn't mean that it is metaphysical. Immersed in the conversation with Evan about this matter, Louise fails to notice the change in her body, so Evan, trying his best to remain cool, tells her calmly to get her shot without getting up. Looking over to a couple sitting in front, he prays to God that they do not turn around to see her face and tail. Thankfully, everything ends peacefully. They head over to a museum then, and after cheerfully discussing paintings in which Louise is depicted, she tells him more clearly what is about to go down with her body. It will soon fade, and the cells will recreate the new one that will contain half of Evan's DNA. If she uses her adult cells, however, her body will stay the same, with the exception that she will be pregnant. This latter will be the equivalent of rejecting eternal life, and she cannot choose to do it herself. Her body will automatically use the adult cells if the level of oxytocin is above a certain level in her body. She can't fake it, because she will have to fully and truly be in love for that to happen. Evan would give up everything to spend the rest of his life with her, and the fact that Louise isn't sure whether she's in love or not seems to be hurting him a lot. He doesn't appear to fully understand the meaning and heaviness of the fact that love for Louise means demise. Later that night, he follows her to the place where she grew up. It's Pompeii, and the reason behind 2,000 years of fear of love and finality is buried in this place. Her parents and her little brother seem to have been smothered in lava while her body endured, and being exposed to demise in such a form, Louise never truly recovered from that. In light of everything Evan has learned about her until now, it seems not that surprising that Louise has been unable to fall in love completely for 2,000 years. The dawn is near. When the fateful time becomes near, Louise says that if she changes her form, it will happen in such a violent way that he will have to run as quickly as he can. They sit, waiting for sunrise, and even though both should be on alert for a terrible beast to come out, they seem unusually peaceful. Evan tells her all about the way fine life feels, and despite the fact that he hears unusual cracking noises coming from Louise, he keeps staring into the distance, describing the way the first and last rays of sun feel like for a mortal human. And he mentions how true love tends to bring magic into every life when a volcano erupts behind him. He looks back, then down to where the cracking noise has stopped, and sees Louise, looking up at him with eyes full of love.